Welcome to the Exhorter podcast, where we aim to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. I'm here with Paul and Kyle, and this is our 30th episode of the first season. And this will be the last episode of this season. And we'll have a little farewell bit at the end, but we'll come back sometime in January and continue with another second round. But Kyle, you're going to lead us off in our last episode of the year. What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, first of all, I want to revisit something we discussed in a previous episode where we talked about your legacy. And we mentioned that there was a bit of a shared family history between the two of us. And we kind of jokingly characterized it as a Hatfields and McCoys kind of situation where, if I remember the details correctly, John, you found a letter going through some of your dad's things, and you found a letter that was between your grandfather, Max Bradford, and my great-grandfather, Roy Goodwin, who was an elder at the church in Cottage Grove. And it was, I think, a debate over the evening observance of the Lord's Supper.
Yeah. And then he kicked him out.
Yeah.
He showed him the road.
Yeah. So we kind of joked about it like that. But the reality is that's not what it was. It was more like a Paul and Barnabas. I don't think it would be characterized as something harsh between the two of them. So we kind of jokingly framed it that way. But then my grandpa, Leroy Goodwin, decided to help us understand just how deep this rabbit hole is and how far back our two families actually are connected. And I thought this was really neat. He sent me a letter and a couple of pictures that we're going to share with the link to this just for fun. But he mentioned that when my grandpa was 5 years old, they moved to London, Oregon, he says. And in that town was two brothers, Pat and Harry Garman. And through the work of my great-grandfather, Roy, he studied with them and eventually baptized them and their wives. And they started going to church together. A few years later, they all moved to Cottage Grove, Oregon, where my great-grandfather, Roy, was an elder. And this is John's great-grandfather, Pat, and his wife, Elva. And one of their daughters was Virginia, about the same age as my grandpa. They were classmates together growing up, and eventually, Max Bradford moved to town, and that's how they met. And so it's just kind of incredible to learn that the connection goes that far back. John, wasn't for my great-grandpa, you wouldn't even be here today.
And just a little bit of history on this one is, Kyle, when did you move to... We had never met, and you moved to Clovis when?
2007.
2007, okay. And you were here for like 2 or 3 months. I don't really think we talked much. You were kind of getting into your job here as a preacher in training. And then we had probably about 8 months of playing basketball, hanging out, playing games, and until you were done, and then you went on. So that's our connection. That's the first time we met. And we stayed in touch for a few years, back and forth. I think you've come into town. Considered you one of my best friends. And then you came out to be a best man in my wedding. And it was just really interesting, though, when I finally coerced you to come back here.
Yeah, after years of trying to convince you to move to Idaho or Utah.
Right, that you end up being here, and I wouldn't have even been here in California if not this history that we found out where my grandparents and great-grandparents originally met yours in Cottage Grove, Oregon, right? It was such a weird story to unfold because it unfolded piece by piece over probably a couple months. It wasn't like we just found out all about this as you came to me and told me the story. And
yeah, when you found that letter among your dad's things, I thought, oh, that's neat. There's just like your grandfather, my great grandpa, they crossed paths.
I thought it was coincidence as there was another Goodwin in Oregon. Little did I know, I wouldn't probably even be here in California, maybe, if it weren't for the church that your great-grandfather started up there in Cottage Grove. So it's just kind of really an odd story, but kind of a fun story.
Well, why do we bring this up? Well, first of all, because I think it was just neat, and I wanted to share that as a follow-up to the episode we did on a legacy. And so I thought it was a neat follow-up, maybe a little indulgent, but it also proves a point I want to make in this episode today that could you imagine our great-grandfathers, our great-grandparents, could you imagine that they even fathomed 4 generations later that 2 of their great-grandsons would be friends working together on a podcast and part of the same church and working and involved in the same kinds of things?
They wouldn't have known what a podcast was, but in general.
And so you often have no clue what the final results of your efforts are going to be. You can see what happens in the immediate future, but oftentimes what you do will have actions that and consequences that carry on throughout. And we want good consequences, but we're so limited and finite. Isaiah 55 and verse 8, it's a very well-known scripture. You'll know this. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I've always read this scripture and looked at that as reassurance that I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Just like our great-grandparents couldn't foresee all that would come of their friendship from years ago. And we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We're not very good judges of success because all we can measure our success by is what we see. And our ability to see is very limited.
One aspect of that story I think that's, I key in on is we've talked a lot of the times through this podcast about how we were raised and spanked and grew up in the church. And to think that them having established that church up there in Cottage Grove and studying together and all that effort would have multiple generations of faithful Christians after is just an amazing thought. It's an amazing thought because if I think about that myself, 4 generations or more, hopefully, come from me, come from us and our kids, that's an amazing thought. That's brings a smile to my face to think of that.
Well, and I'm not sure if there's much, if at all, anything left of that church in Cottage Grove anymore. So if you measure success by what you can see, you could look at the church there that they were a part of, and my great-grandfather was evangelizing and teaching and trying to bring people in the way Christians should. You could look at it by one metric and say, well, the church doesn't exist anymore, or if it does, it's very small. And you could look at that and say, not very successful. It didn't last. But if you can see from a bigger perspective, they couldn't see what would happen after them. And that's where we need to lean on God's perspective. He's so far above us. His thoughts are so far above our thoughts that we're not very good judges of our success sometimes.
Yeah. So Paul, in the first episode we did of this one of your legacy, it was all about Paul's story. So we just had to drum up our own story and be like, so there, we have one too, Paul. But I
remember something about being baptized in was it the Old Man River?
Old Man River, yeah.
Right. That was my dad.
Yeah. But this legacy of our fathers before us, and it's all a sobering thought.
And your families have since reconciled, so I'm glad to.
Not on that subject, actually.
For now.
Yeah, we're still divided on that same subject.
And next season, we're going to have more disagreements, just to make it interesting. Please. So we'll see if this relationship survives.
Well, I really just wanted to bring up this story to highlight that point that we don't always know what's going to come from our actions. We can't always see the ultimate consequence or the ultimate realization of our efforts in this lifetime. So we have to trust in God, who is so far above us, and let him be the judge and make the assessment of our success. So how we do that, that's what I want to focus on in this episode. I know it's kind of a roundabout way to get to it. I just couldn't resist bringing up that neat family connection and all the history that my grandfather shared. But let's talk about making plans. If we're going to be successful, we have to come up with plans. Some of us are really good at planning. Others, like myself, just kind of wing it and try to plan. But I've never been very good at organization. But I understand this principle that, it's like what Proverbs 21 and verse 5 says. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. So we do need to make some plans, and we do that in life. In fact, this is a time of year. This is why I wanted to do this episode as the last one of the season, also the last one of the calendar year for 2022, because we're thinking about plans for 2023, resolutions. What are some of your guys' plans? Let's just talk about plans for a minute. What are some of your plans for this next year? What are your goals or resolutions, if you will?
Kyle, a few years ago, I tried to be a little more deliberate, and I wrote down a lot of different goals, and they included some of the standard, not just the fact that I wanted to be better about reading my Bible on a more regular basis, but my prayer life, be a better husband, to be a better parent. And then underneath, I had some specific things I wanted to do. And looking back, I still have that piece of paper because it was almost overwhelming. What I put down was a lot, and it almost shamed me later in the year because I felt like I hadn't accomplished half of it. But a lot today, I think some of the same things come up for me. We make these resolutions kind of get a bad name because people start them, and 30 days, 45 days, first quarter of the year and it's over. But I'm going to say for myself, it's so easy in the busyness of life to lose sight of just that daily relationship with God, reading my Bible and praying. But I'm going to say for me, it's going to be being a little more deliberate about spending time with my brethren, being with people who have a common faith and trying to build each other up.
I have a tendency to do the same, to think of just all the things in the world that I should do. So then I kind of put that all as my list to do. And I think that that's kind of the opposite of, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And I always tell my wife, you can't quit Starbucks cold turkey. You got to wean yourself off. You got to do things that are easier, manageable, realistic. And that's what they have, those SMART goals, something that is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And so the goal is if you really want to try to achieve something, you got to put a little bit more time and effort into it. And I think something I'd like to do this year, I like to do these projects and I like to do these things to help build better relationships. So in the church, I think that I'm going to continue to try to do those kinds of things. And then my kids are come about this right time where now just spending more time with them, taking my son with me wherever I go, teaching him all the things that I can as I go throughout my life and things like that. And where I might have left them at home to do things. And I think I just need to remind myself to take them with me and take that time to teach them and spend a little more time in that place.
Well, some of the most impactful lessons I learned from my dad were when he'd take me along to help someone move, especially when I was younger and I wasn't really much help, but it had an impression on me that's active faith. That's what your faith should look like in practice, is actually helping people, or going and doing yard work for someone at church or some project at their house and getting some people together from church to do something. I'd go with him. I don't know if it's just because he was watching us that day or if it was intentional. I'd like to think it was intentional, but it did have an impact on me. And I have some simple goals this year. I would like to lose some weight. That's a recurring goal for me. But after our podcast on gluttony, I've been thinking a lot more seriously about that, putting in some actual thought to how to do that.
Well, I need to do the same because I can't take the kids with me if I'm not around. I gotta take better care of ourselves, and I mean those are on everyone's lists. Take better care of ourselves and eat less, exercise more. All of it.
Well, and for me, it's less TV, more reading, and reading in general, but also specifically the Bible. As a preacher, I'm always reading the Bible. But it's because I'm reading a text that I'm going to be teaching on Wednesday, or I'm reading to prepare a sermon. I don't read very much for me, just reading so that I'm connected with God. And so that's something I want to emphasize this year too. So we need to make goals, but we need to understand too that we're so limited. Again, that's why I brought up that first story with our families, that it was a good thing. They couldn't see all the good that would happen. They couldn't know it. My great-grandfather was just interested in teaching and bringing people to the Lord. And beyond that, it was kind of in God's hands what fruit would come from that effort. And you never really know.
What's interesting, though, is would they have done anything different? Was that their goal, right? Was their goal to have multiple generations of people? Did they achieve their goal? It's hard to tell, looking back on those things, but they didn't necessarily get so caught up in what their goal was. Probably they just did the right thing. They did that thing that was important at that time. And so I think sometimes we should look further on what's the goal and impact we want to make, and then we need to do things that help us to get there. But a lot of times we just need to deal with the things we need to in the present and pray and hope and lean on God to grant the increase, right?
But I think what you were saying was you don't even know if that church is still around, but the legacy goes way beyond just that church. I recently had to sign an agreement. It's a trust agreement, and there's several of us that are trustees of a church that no longer exists. And it's up in Alberta, Canada. And it's a church that my grandfather and my family had a big part in starting, but that church no longer exists. And so as I read the paperwork, I'm proud to be on this trust because it's to use the funds in a way that will glorify God, preaching in Canada or wherever it may be. But I'm sad the church no longer exists. But your point kind of made me think about it, was the legacy goes way beyond that. It's goals that we may thought was, maybe it was that this church is here forever, but really there's faithful future generations that they had no idea they were even preparing for, potentially, that you're both a result of here today.
Yeah, none of the congregations we read about in the first century in the New Testament are still there, but the Lord's kingdom still thrives. And sometimes a church diminishes, a congregation diminishes in one part of the world. Another part of the world, they start popping up and thriving. And so that's the point I wanted to make. I know this has been a roundabout way to get to it, but I really just want to talk about how we measure success. Our ability to gauge our success is somewhat limited by our inability to see really anywhere into the future. We can predict what might happen in the next couple hours, next couple days, next couple weeks, but our ability to know with certainty is so limited. So we need to just focus on doing the right things, listening to God, doing what he asks us to do, and not worry about things that we can't know. So I guess the main question of this episode is, how do you handle it when plans don't go your way? Sometimes you make a plan and it just doesn't happen the way you want. Your plan gets turned upside down. How do you react to that? Have you guys ever had something like that happen to you, where you made a plan and you were going in a direction and it just, life or circumstance happen in unpredictable ways?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it happens all the time, right? I think for me, most recently, it was a occupational plan. I had plans for the future of a certain job and what that job would, the life it would give me for my family, and what that all looked like. And I talked to people about it for years and was really excited about it for years. And it was kind of my thing, it was my thing to tell people about and be proud of and put some time and effort into, and kind of like a sports career, something happens, doesn't end up being that job for you, or the future's not there in that. And so that's what happened with me. And I no longer in that job and that company, but I think my go-to is to just put on a smile and kind of just push through it. I think I'm really good about just pressing forward, and I think that's good for different reasons, good for my family and good for the moment, but I do think I could do better at reflecting on those things and become better emotionally with the results of them.
Well, and that's certainly a jarring change. With the one career, you had a path out in front of you that you could see stretching out for years in front, ahead of you. Mm-hmm. And again, that's the whole point of this episode is our thoughts are not God's thoughts. We can't direct our steps. We can't see what's coming. We can make a plan, but life doesn't always go the way we intend it to go.
Yeah.
God can see everything from 30,000 feet. We see everything from 1 foot away. We can't see the big picture very well. So that's why it's probably such a jarring thing for you, is you had such a clear path out in front of you.
Yeah. But on the other side of it, as soon as that wasn't my path anymore, you know what I was able to do? This podcast. I mean, I was able to do a lot more things. And my wife was telling me the other day, she's like, yeah, if you were still working at that job, look at all the things that you would have not had time to do and to focus on. And she's right. And I think that is probably just one of those things where God shows you what you need, not what you want, kind of thing. And looking back at it, it was definitely a blessing to pivot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I've had some similar, different circumstances, but similar ideas, similar experiences in my life with job changes. About four years ago, I moved to San Antonio, Texas, and I, very much like I described you, I could see a path in front of me that stretched for years. That was my plan. So I could see a path that stretched out in front of me for years, and that was my long-term plan. We moved to Texas to stay there. But then we had some very challenging things come up in our family, loss of a loved one. My brother-in-law passed away, and that kind of changed our priorities. And we ended up moving to Idaho to move into more of a support role for family. And we went from eagerness and excitement for a new move in Texas to now grieving. And so it really changed. Everything screeched to a halt, and it changed. I'll talk about some of the ways I handled that as well. But Paul, I'm sure you've got some similar experiences too, where you were caught off guard or you had a plan and then life just said, nope.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously the biggest life change, is we've talked about in this podcast before, is in your family life. There's certain goals that you have, and early in my life, in my 20s, going through divorce and having children, that I had plans for my family and for how I wanted to do things. Thought I was doing them the way that I thought was right from reading God's word, and it still didn't seem to work the way that I hoped it would. So that was a real challenge for me in that way. And then when my son Scott was born, I had certain plans that I thought was going to go a certain way, and the challenges that he had were very different than what I expected as far as just the journey and how that was going to affect our family. But those are probably the two biggest in my life, and they affected everything, as far as how I looked at things, and they affected even how I looked at God's plan for my family. And I realized that God has a perfect plan, but it takes all of us together doing it to make it work. It doesn't mean that if you do things a certain way, it's guaranteed to work without everybody doing it. So that was probably the biggest for me.
There's lots of big picture things like that seem like the big things, but sometimes it's even small things that send, you look at it and you're like, why did that affect me so much? That didn't pan out, a trip got canceled, right? Or something happened. And sometimes that just rocks people like so bad when you have expectations and they just don't work out that way. And I mean, it just cuts people to the core. And I guess when you do have a lot of larger things in life, I think it helps to have perspective. Kind of helps me, when little things don't happen, I just kind of brush them off, I think. But I do notice that it probably is more about how much that thing meant to you or how much you bought into the expectation of that outcome. And I think that's why God's wisdom about, what is the verse? James chapter 4.
You're thinking James chapter 4 and verse 13 that says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. But you don't know what will happen tomorrow."
Right. So it's like
he just quoted that.
I
That
know,
was amazing.
that's amazing. It's important to make plans, but to think that you're in absolute control of those plans, you get humbled really fast.
And it's important to be able to roll with the punches and learn how to adapt. So we all shared some experiences we've had that where life took our plans and turned them upside down, or they came screeching to a halt because of circumstances we couldn't foresee because we're so limited in our ability to see what's coming up. And how do we adapt to that? Well, we're not the only ones. I'm sure you guys, all our listeners, have had similar experiences. You've made plans and it just didn't work. And you're right about the small things too, John. I think about, I don't know how many times I've gotten serious about losing weight and I start working out and then I get a really bad cold. I start coughing, and so I'm like, okay, I'm going to wait a week. I think that's Satan doing that to me.
No, it's God. It's in his time, okay? Just put it off till tomorrow. It'll happen.
But the Apostle Paul, I think, is a great example for us to consider in the Bible because he also made plans, and he shared his plans. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he told the Corinthians, I want to come and spend some time with you, several months, like a long period of time. I think he said, I want to spend the whole winter with you. But then you get to 2 Corinthians and he says, I wasn't vacillating when I said that. Just things happen in a way I couldn't predict. I wasn't being disingenuous. I really intended to come visit you, but something prevented that from happening. And in Romans 15, he tells the Romans, I haven't seen you guys in person yet. I want to come visit you guys in Rome, and I want to go to Spain. And so he made all these plans, and going to Rome was one of those stops. But we know when we read the book of Acts, he gets to Jerusalem in chapter 21 and almost gets killed by an angry mob and gets arrested. And now there's this debate. And so he's on trial for his life. And that's not the way he planned things to go. That's not what Paul wanted to happen. So even an apostle is not above having plans come crashing down. Now, the formula for overcoming the disappointment when your plans fail, I think, is in Philippians chapter 1. When we look at the way Paul dealt with this, we can learn a lot by his reflections in his letter to the Philippians. Paul is writing this letter from that Roman prison cell, and he's awaiting trial. And so it's an incredible perspective, and it's someone in the middle of regathering himself and formulating a new plan and a new strategy. And it's all about how he's coping with this change in plans that he's forced to make now. I think the most important thing to observe with Paul is that he never lost sight of the main goal, never once. He was always focused on the right things. When we read in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, Paul says, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what I shall choose I cannot tell, for I'm hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you." So Paul never lost sight of the main goal. Yes, his plans changed. He didn't get to Rome the way he wanted to. It's funny, at the end of the book of Acts, he gets there, just not in the way he wanted to. But he never lost sight of the main goal, because he says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. No matter what happens, if he lived on, he would continue to glorify Christ and continue to help and instruct others. And if he died, he says that's a victory too. So in each of the situations we described, I think part of the answer for all of us is that we had to look for that greater purpose. And so when these situations come up, that's something we can learn from Paul, is always trying to look at not why. We don't want to dwell on why did this happen, because sometimes there's just not a good answer for that question. Maybe we need to dwell on how can I use this to glorify Christ, or in my new circumstance, which I didn't foresee happening, how can I use this to glorify Christ?
Paul's such a good example with all what he went through. You think when he gave up, he thought he was going the right direction when he was denying Christ. So you think that already was a big change. So he's a guy that thought he was going, that he thought that was God's plan. God showed him, nope, that's not the plan. And then when he gets on the right path, it was horrible for him personally. I mean, just think about all he went through when God put him on that path. And you have to wonder at times he may have thought, God, really, is this the plan? And it makes me think, Kyle, of David too. Here David is told about this big plan through Samuel. You're going to be the king. You think, it's going to be, his life's going to change. What happens? He's now in the wilderness, running away from Saul. I've heard it described as God's training plan in a way, that some of the things that both Paul and David may not have understood at the time, later, when we see the wisdom that they learned through those experiences. So I heard a preacher describe it kind of like an archer shooting an arrow. You got to pull that thing back, and it may seem like the arrow's going backwards, but it's so that it can get the full force to go further forward. Well, David, because of his experiences, because of what he went through, was propelled forward, but he didn't see that. He didn't know. It's kind of your point. We can't see God's complete plan. We like to make plans, but we really have to trust in him. And both Paul and David demonstrated that for us.
Yeah. Well, even Joseph, perhaps even to a greater degree, his final assessment was when his brothers came and were terrified of him, he said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." There's no way Joseph could have known exactly how this was going to turn out when he was sold as a slave and then sold into Potiphar's house and then thrown into the dungeon. There's no way he could have foreseen that he would someday be the most powerful man aside from Pharaoh.
And yet it kind of looks like he did, because his countenance didn't fall. I mean, he was an example for us for staying the course and having faith in God, like Job,
And that's what he did. Every step of the way, when he was sold into Potiphar's house, he worked hard and was recognized for that hard work. And then it blew up in his face. But he was just, I don't know, if I'm sold as a slave into someone's house, I'm going to spit in their dishes or something. When
Good to know. Good to know.
Well, yeah, if I'm up
Put
for
your
sale
dishes
as a
away,
slave,
Woodcock.
Yeah. Don't go eat at Kyle's house and insult the food or anything.
Yeah. Well, just, if I'm someone's slave, I'm going to be a little bitter about that.
Yeah.
But Joseph he worked hard, and he was recognized for it. Then Potiphar's wife kind of blew up in his face. Not his fault. He's in the dungeon. Again, he makes the best of that situation. So I'm just going to do what's right.
And the common thing there can actually be seen in Romans 8:28 when it says, "We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." So what was the unifying factor to Job and to Joshua and to, all these great examples for us is just leaning consistently on God. And, when you do that, all things will work out.
Yeah. When my plan blows up in my face, it humbles me and reminds me of how finite my reasoning abilities are, my planning skills can be at times. And it should force us to lean upon someone with a much clearer perspective. Again, God's up there from 30,000 feet. not literally. But God's up there from 30,000 feet. He can see everything that we can't. So listen to him when he gives us instructions, when we read in the Bible, instructions about our life. Just do what he's asking. Just follow his instructions, follow his guidance, because he can see much more clear than you can. So Paul never lost sight of what the main goal was. He says, if I live, it's for Christ. If I die, then that's gain. Then I've won the reward. But another great perspective here, and this is something I heard in a sermon 15 years ago that's always stuck with me. We hear the concept of collateral damage. That's where a fight is happening and people get caught in the crossfire. They weren't the intended targets, but they're a consequence of the two sides fighting. That's collateral damage, unintended damage. Perhaps the opposite can also be true, that there are sometimes collateral blessings, unintended blessings that arise from an unpredictable situation. And I think that's what Paul talks about again in Philippians chapter 1. When you focus in on the section between verses 12 and 18, he begins to talk about, well, my imprisonment has actually been a good thing.
It fueled other Christians.
Yeah, others have become more bold because they've heard of my boldness in prison. But he also talks about the whole Praetorian Guard. He had a captive audience. He said, it's given me an opportunity to talk to people that I might not have otherwise had an opportunity. Is it what Paul wanted or intended for his life, to be in a prison cell? Absolutely not. But he looked at it and said, okay, I'm here. I can't change it. Being bitter, being upset, being frustrated won't change my circumstances. So first things first, I'm going to glorify God. And when you put God first, like our first point, you put glorifying God and make that your main goal, it's going to open your eyes to see that, yeah, on the surface, this didn't go the way I wanted. But if my eyes are open and I'm focused on Christ, I'm going to start seeing collateral blessings left and right.
And that is something that we need as parents to do a lot better, to show our kids when things don't go well, things don't go right, how to deal with those. I mean, they will internalize that. They will learn from us and how we react to things in life not working out, whether it be a trip that gets canceled or something tragic happens with you. It's just really important to show them how it is to lean on God and to not get so down when things don't work out our way.
Yeah, I moved to Texas thinking I was going to be there, and I think I was right to think that. There was a good opportunity. It was a great congregation, and I was excited to be there. But also, circumstances just pulled us in a different direction. Moving forward, we decided to begin to look, and I'm very, very happy with where I am now in life. I never intended to be back in California. I never imagined I would.
No one ever intends on coming back.
But here I am.
There you are.
And it's just one of those unintended collateral blessings in life that being here has been a blessing. Being here, a place where I can work, my family can have opportunities to serve in this congregation and serve people around us. It's given us that purpose that we needed. And it's been such a blessing, but it wasn't something I intended to happen.
And the Goodwins and Bradfords could be reunited.
Once again.
For now.
Yeah.
Until the big debates next year's podcast.
I still want that picture of us back to back with our big old beards long, with our pistols at our sides.
Well, it's not this Hatfield McCoy thing won't be settled till at least, we have at least one marriage between Bradfords and Goodwins.
We'll see.
One final thing we can see from Paul that is great for if you're looking for some New Year's resolution material, make your resolutions about someone else. Now, I talked about losing weight, reading the Bible, but I also want to be more evangelistic than I have been, even more. I want to continue to excel still more in evangelism. And if you make your goals about others, and that's something we see about Paul, I already mentioned that, part of me looks at being in a prison cell and I'm ready to just be done, because if I die, it's much better. I go to be with Christ. But he says, if I live on, I know it's more fruitful labor. I know it's for your benefit. You can see what was keeping Paul going was being there to serve others. So if you're going to make some goals for this year, make your goals about service. Make your goals about improving someone else's life.
And glorifying God.
And you're going to find some collateral blessings in your own life by doing that.
And if you're focusing on how is this effort that I'm thinking about doing that I believe is important, how will it glorify God and his kingdom and our family, then God will grant that increase.
So all I've described is just the greatest command. Love God, love others, love your neighbor as yourself. If you keep those as your goals, that will help you navigate those challenging spots in life where where your plans get flipped, turned upside down.
I saw what you
And
did
next
there.
thing you know, you're the Prince of Bel-Air.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle, thank you for that topic. As we end this new year and begin the next, it gives us a lot to think about. And really, at the end of the day, focusing and trusting on God no matter what. On behalf of all of us, I think we want to stop by just first thanking you for listening this year. This is our first season. Our plans also don't know how many more seasons we're going to do. But I will say your responses, your reaching out when there's not an episode posted, because that means you actually want to listen. That means something to us, actually. So thank you for doing that and for all that you've done. But as we enter this new year, we had a theme each year at the church in Clovis, and the elders will be unveiling a new theme in the new year. But if you listen to this podcast, you get a special preview because you're a listener. And that theme is 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. It says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." There's so much to unpack in that verse, and perhaps in a future podcast we'll unpack that more. But we want to introduce you to that as a conclusion to this episode as well, that whatever circumstances you might find yourself in, as Kyle was leading us through today, you need to have that attitude to be steadfast, be immovable, and continue to focus on that work of the Lord and remember what it's all about. If you do that, your work is never in vain. Gentlemen, before we close out, any closing words you want to say to our listeners for the end of this year?
Like Paul said, it's just very appreciative of those who find it valuable, tell us that they're listening. It would be valuable even if no one was listening. I think we get a good time of this, and it's definitely helped my study life and my ways of thinking, and the impact that your guys' thoughts and brains have given to my thoughts about things. And I enjoy the discussion and the coffee when we have it. So it's a great work, and I appreciate you two being a part of it, and just continuing to do it next year would be really great. The one thing I would ask is, I would just love to hear what's important to you. Reach out to us, let us know personally, put comments on wherever you see this podcast. We just want them to be relevant into your everyday lives. And if you can just reach out to us and let us know topics and things that you're interested in knowing more about or hearing a discussion about, that'd be great.
Well, in measuring success for this endeavor, it has always been kind of tricky for me. Do we measure it by number of views or listens? Do we measure it by the amount of feedback? Those factors are helpful, but I consider this to be a good thing. If we're putting out there exhortation from God's word, that's good enough for me. I might not, like our great-grandparents, couldn't even fathom the kinds of things that would happen, the ripple effects that would happen generations later. I don't know what will come of this podcast, how it might impact or help people, but I know we're planting seeds. I know we're putting out the word of God, and I know that's always a good thing. So I'm excited to have done this first season. I'm excited to keep doing this, and I'll measure my success by how biblically based these podcasts remain.
Great wrap up. And I just want to say personally, Kyle, thank you. I've enjoyed it. John, thank you. And John doesn't like the attention, but really the magic and the time, he puts more time into just cutting out our coughs, our sighs, our chokes, all the stuff behind, all the mess ups that we make. John makes us sound better than we really are. Which means you cut yourself out sometimes too. You always sound great.
So much of my stuff. It's sorry. That's the blessing of the editor. Just say that no, they don't need to hear me.
No, John does a great job. So thank you for that. Again, thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you for listening this season to the Exhorter podcast. Please share this, like it on Facebook, and looking forward to seeing you in 2023. Thank you for listening.
Did you turn down the volume in my headset?
Yeah.
The clearing of your throat is deafening.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's a little better.
Is that better? No, I was laughing because here's like, if they continue to be biblically based, I mean, do you expect, what is our expectations? Are we stopping that? It's no longer a part of our...
All right, just scratch that last comment.
No, it's me in there.
If it's not quiet.
There's a joke. There's kind of like a joke, and have you ever heard it? It's kind of a joke. It's the, what is the most richest, expensive, profitable land in the world?
California. San Francisco, California.
What about you? You have any idea? You're falling prey to the location bit, but It's a little less of a joke and more of a quote, and it comes from this man Les Brown, and it's: "The graveyard is the richest place on earth because it is here you will find all the hopes and dreams that were never fulfilled, the books that were never written, the songs that were never sung, the inventions that were never shared, the cures that were never discovered, all because someone was too afraid to take the first step, keep with the problem, or determined to carry out their dream." I love that quote. It's a good quote. So,
not a joke, though.
It's not really a joke. Say, I got you on the...
Why did Frosty the Snowman go to the grocery store?
Yeah.
So he wanted to pick his nose.
That should have been on the screen. All right. We're out.